Hi everyone, thanks so much for paying attention for a little while. This is a talk that I've given a couple times before about love and the internet and how relationships are sort of collapsing under a tautological meta-nightmare. So, in 1984, the year that I was born, William Gibson termed cyberspace, coined the word cyberspace, and defined it as a consensual hallucination experienced daily by billions of legitimate operators. And although that novel predated the universal adoption of the World Wide Web as a communication technology, and his internet, as he defined it, as a sort of virtual reality semantic space where you can navigate information via distances and structures, that's not, at least not yet, our web. He was right, I think, in calling the network a hallucination. We all know on some foggy level that the internet is made up of tactile things, that it's a real object in the world, a grandly diffuse object, but an object nonetheless, that's composed of routers and computers and vast fiber optic backbones underneath the ocean. But the consensual hallucination of our time is that we imagine it as something that's ineffable. In fact, the trend of the moment now is to think about the internet as a cloud, which for most people conjures up this idea of information floating intangibly in the firmament. And although we can't see it there, we sort of place it up there with language and with collective belief. This movement towards thinking about the internet as something abstract shows absolutely no terms of slowing. If you think about another one of our science fiction prophets, Arthur C. Clarke, he said that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, and we are reaching that point. Well, of course, we've always been this way. I mean, most of us don't know how our wristwatches or our cars work. We interface with our technology, the parts of our technology that cater to our monkey hands, like slots and buttons, and for most of us at least, you know, all these plastic and metal boxes that dot our world are largely beyond us in terms of their workings. And those who do know how these systems work, which I imagine is a lot of people here actually, comprise such a small segment of the population that they kind of wield disproportionate power. We call them programmers or hackers, and most people take for granted that knowledge that they have is somehow inaccessible or arcane, while simultaneously throwing themselves unthinkingly into the technium 12 hours a day. This is particularly true, I think, for younger generations. I'm 28, so I can remember a time before the internet really dominated my relationships and my personal life, but a lot of my younger friends can't. And sometimes when I'm perusing the accounts of my followers on Instagram, I discover all of these attention-hungry teenagers who quantify their popularity and hence to a certain level their identity by all of the quantifiable matrices of traffic towards their small corner of the internet, by follow backs and at replies. Their neediness kind of leaps off the screen. It's a lot of follow me, follow me, follow me, I'll follow you back, I always follow back. Which, you know, if you think about it, is kind of a closed system because, you know, they're just going in circles. The emotional quality of that need is really directly proportionate to how real the experience of the online is for younger people. The difference between a relationship lived in the world and a relationship lived online is sometimes indistinguishable. As they say on the internet, pics or it didn't happen, which I think is more profound than we think. It's not just teenagers. I mean, I'm sure all of us are the same way. I prefer email to the phone. I've gotten to a point where the phone is just horrifying. And I also like being able to, by typing in the name of an individual, sum up and draw up all of our correspondences from the moment that we began corresponding. It's this like incredibly simultaneous experience of the relationship condensed and presented to you in a way that makes it feel like it doesn't have a temporal nature at all. It's always existing in this one space. You know, for any intimacy that's experienced partially through the medium of the web, this chronological record that conflates past and present for a lot of intents and purposes kind of becomes the relationship. We are more than the sum of our experiences. We've become the sum of our recorded experiences. And as we increasingly live our social lives publicly in a medium that, although ever-shifting, retains all the traces of our noodling, the asymptote of the record and the relationship reaches a point of indistinguishability. Of course, my parents' generation did this differently. Instead of a conflated inbox of ones and zeros, they had a box of love letters under the bed. But the difference is this. While the box of love letters and my email correspondences may serve the same purpose, if you burn a box of love letters or a scrapbook of mementos in a fit of pique, all of a sudden the relationship only exists in the minds of the people that experienced it. It becomes subjective, foggy, and headed inevitably, as all memories do, towards forgetting. We don't need proofs to tell us that memories are unreliable, and you don't need me to tell you that people, especially young people, no longer have the freedom to forget. It's interesting to note here, as an aside, the shifting definition of the word memory. I think before computing, memory meant something singularly unreliable. By definition, a memory was a ghost, a strange and personal evocation of a completely felt experience, something subjective and fallible. Now memory is a technical specification, something that can be counted and counted on. It's also monolithic. I have memories, whatever they are, but my computer has memory. Of course, the moment that we began taking photos, making films, making art, or externalizing the human experience through so-called mass media, we set into motion an immeasurably vast prosthetic memory for the human race. Art is a complex memory that we collaboratively create. And what we can't live directly or recall, we can live secondhand through art, through film, through data. We can lose touch with the difference between our own memories and the memories of others. We can see things that happened before we were born. We can watch ghosts talk. I think this is another William Gibson thing. We are building ourselves mirrors that remember, public mirrors that wander around and remember what they've seen. But all these definitions of memory are approaching one another now, because today's memories are distributed across a network. A sufficiently talented hacker or web archaeologist or curious third party could, in reconstituting all the little pieces of data left behind, could reconstitute a relationship from the traces that it's left behind online. We think that we're clever with our selective curation of our personal information online, but every click leaves a trace. We all know this. I mean, our online shopping records, our air travel itineraries, all the likes and tweets and retweets and emails, all of the articles and books that we read on recommendation, and in a slightly more abstract sense, just the ideas that we absorb from the people that we love and disseminate outwards endlessly to our extended communities. In a sense, now every relationship exists on two levels. There's the real, the moments that we spend in close proximity with one another, the neurochemical effect of proximity. And then the digital, just as physical places now all have a second reality of location-based game layers. Every relationship, too, has a digital component, a digital shadow. And depending on the nature of the people involved, that shadow can defy real-world physics. It can loom larger than the object which casts it. Of course, this is a simplification. I mean, in truth, all relationships now contain a sort of inextricable mix of digital and real components combined in the fabric of the simultaneous now. But in either case, this causes problems when relationships end. In a world where the relationship and its record share so much real estate that they're often confused for one another, defining an end to either of them can seem impossible. We're all familiar with this scenario, I'm sure. You've terminated a romantic relationship or a friendship for whatever reason. You've burned the box of love letters, figuratively or otherwise. Perhaps you've untagged yourself from all of their photos on Facebook, which is the 21st century version of cutting your ex-boyfriend's face out of the yearbook. You've deleted their emails. But the social web does not want you to sever ties with anyone. At every turn, it asks you to reconsider. The entire economic engine depends on the vibrancy and activity of connection, because groups are the commodity being sold, not individuals. The architecture of the social web, like a Vegas casino, will always lead you back inside relationships that you want to leave behind. It's increasingly difficult to end things. We don't experience emotional cataclysms anymore. We simply surgically remove touch. Ruptures, serious ruptures, are softened by, instead of cutting someone out of your life, you can now hide them from your timeline. And even when a connection is explicitly severed via the act of unfriending, which is, despite being the ultimate, act of drama, is, like the poke, a completely meaningless act. Aspects of that person will always fall through the cracks, through mutual friends, through images, and through advertisements tailored to your extinguished needs. The vast and broadly disseminated collection of bits which has served for so long as a record of your private and public entanglement with somebody else will always remain. It might not be immediately accessible to you, but the information that you were friends or that you were lovers lives on. It's there somewhere. I mean, when subpoenaed, Facebook can and will produce an insanely mighty document of every click and poke. There is a record. At the end of a bad relationship, you would think to yourself that it was a waste of time. And, having wasted a lot of time or energy on something which ultimately failed is part of being human. And these regrets define us, and we console ourselves by saying that they make us who we are, that they brought us to this point. They prepared us for the following challenges. And that's true in life. But while your failed relationships may well have been a waste of your time, the digital shadows which they cast, which make up a significant bulk of their existence now, those are only a waste of your bandwidth. And since we're speaking of an internetwork, really it's our bandwidth. I should clarify. There are different kinds of connections. There's connections between people, expressed in shared moments and feelings and touch, actions and words, and the profound communion of shared silence. And then there's the connections between computers, which are expressed in terms of packets and protocols. But all of these varieties of connection require a type of bandwidth. And one can think of the capacity to put time and effort into maintaining a functional relationship with another human being as a kind of emotional or personal bandwidth. Love, like light, passes through all of us, like information down a fiber optic backbone. And although each individual has their own specific capacity for love, some people can love more than one person at the same time, some people can only love themselves, some people can only love one person their whole lives. That emotional bandwidth is fluid and subjective, capable of changing with time as we grow wiser or less wise. But our digital bandwidth is quantifiable, and unfortunately, its record continues to exist even when the actual relationship doesn't. Overusage of emotional bandwidth is taxing on the individual. Like a computer network, we must be properly peered. That is to say, physically and voluntarily interconnected to the other party, allowing the information of the relationship to pass through both parties equally, improving the functionality and the traffic of that small system in a mutually beneficent contract. Without that vital back and forth, individuals, like machines, can overheat and collapse. Of course, I made it fit. Of course, as none of us operate in a vacuum, improperly peered personal systems damage not only the individual but the entire extended network. In brief, if one person reaches the limit of their capacity to love and fails, we all do. The free-for-all of the World Wide Web is nearing its end, if not over. At its peak, we had the freedom to make mistakes because we still had unlimited data plans and we still had a margin of anonymity. But now, as our internet service providers have become the slow throttling of our bandwidth and our privacy is increasingly dubious, we no longer can speed intoxicated down what was once so innocently called information superhighway. We all experience the internet as a means to access profound emotional experiences in the world beyond us. But our providers will always see it as dollars and bits. In order to defeat this problem, I think that we must begin to treat it that way as well. Because now that we face the possibility of reaching our cap, every relationship is an investment. Every relationship is a risk. One in which, by eating through our bandwidth, may ultimately limit our access to the outside world. This isn't necessarily a modern problem. People in love have always disappeared from the world, but they've always been able to come back once the waves of their neurochemical buzz have crested. To limit the scenario of an overburdened, overtaxed, and unbalanced personal network, we must embrace the quantification of relationships. We have the technology to accurately measure and display not just our personal emotional bandwidth, which remains fluid and subjective, but the actual bandwidth incurred by our constant communication, observation, and search for information and services regarding our partner or partners. While the traces that a relationship leaves on a physical individual are ultimately mutable, we can break down some key quantifiable variables. 1, the time spent on a relationship online. 2, the cost of your connection. And 3, the bandwidth usage that relationship entails. Ultimately, we can arrive at a dollar amount of precisely how much per bit per second of your usage was spent on any given person. When you pair two sets of data like that, it can effectively alert you when your partner's interest is waning and provide you with an additional tool for reading the state of your partner's affections. The human interface conceals as much as it reveals. But this kind of data is bald and apparent. Of course, I'm fucking with you. I mean, That probably will happen. Probably will happen. But there's another option, and it's much less draconian. Instead of inventing emotional bandwidth solutions, or as I like to call them, EBS, we can just invest in the future of our hearts. We don't need to leave the binary husks of our relationships behind us. We just have to be more considered with everything that we do. Not just our flirtations, but everything we do online. The temptation to tag, cite, post, and discover others through their forward-facing digital avatars is great. But the rewards of love under the radar is much more profound. Love undocumented is love unadvertised and unexploited, as well as unexploitable. It is love that will fade gently, like a photograph, instead of creeping up algorithmically like a Google image search result. Some might say this is a Luddites approach, but when it comes to love, we might all be Luddites. Who wouldn't smash the machine that told them precisely when and where they were replaced? Unfortunately, the global index that contains every gossamer byte of our love letters, not the ones tied under the bed, tied with velvet ribbon, but the ones that we are always writing unknowingly, the ones that write us as we try to make contact across flat planes of heartless LED. It's unsmashable. Who can smash a concept, a consensual hallucination, a backbone beneath the sea? No. Instead of taking hammer to motherboard, we must tread carefully between the rows of servers. We must whisper and count every crack so as not to disturb the senseless chatter shooting all around our heads or find ourselves regretting and surrounded by the past as we try to fall in love in the age of machines. Thank you.